Let me ask you first, Congressman Becerra, when Donald Trump says, "I can fix it," I mean, he does resonate with that message across the country. I've been to a lot of these rallies. It resonates because people are just sick and tired of Washington. Isn't that an effective message for him?
If he could prove that he could fix things, perhaps it would be. If he could prove that this is a country that does things on its own, where we don't work together as a team, perhaps. But this is America, an America where we have built this country, we have fought and saved our democracy together. And saying you can do things by yourself won't cut it, especially when, in fact, what you've been doing is benefiting yourself and not necessarily trying to help your fellow Americans. When he talks about bringing jobs to America, well, he could start by first manufacturing Trump ties in America, manufacturing Trump suits in America. Instead, he seems to be saying that he's all about himself and he puts himself first. You can't do things by yourself. This is a country where we do things as a team.
And Congressman Blackburn, let me ask you about the Democratic convention, because Khizr Khan seemed to steal the show from just about everybody. And he pulled out that Constitution and he accused Donald Trump of not fully understanding the Constitution. Do you think he fully understands the Constitution?
I do think Donald Trump understands the Constitution, and I think he fully understands how you make this country great. You allow individuals to have the opportunity to make the country great. Let's bring back manufacturing. Let's deal with the EPA. Let's deal with regulatory overreach. Let's make certain that people have the opportunity to dream those big dreams and make those dreams come true.
Should he manufacture ties and suits in America?
But
I would love to see those come back, and I think he would too. But look at what
Why
has
do we have to
happened
wait? He
because
doesn't have
of
to be
all this
president to bring those
regulation.
jobs back to America.
Look at
He
what
can do
has
it right
happened
now.
because of all this regulation. And
Regulations
there
haven't
are lots
stopped
of
Donald Trump
companies
from
I
manufacturing
call,
ties in
I
America.
talk to. Now, I think you need to rethink that one right
But
there. Look at what
Congressman.
OSHA, Department of Labor, the EPA
Congressman.
are doing to this country. Look at what has happened to manufacturing in the South. Come through my district. Look at all of these
Congressman,
clothing.
that's not the issue. When
That
what
is-
Khizr Khan's
it is
talking,
the
that's not
issue.
the issue. What Khizr Khan is talking about, when he's going up there, when he and his wife are standing up there, they're talking about, and you saying, yes, it's about individuals being able to make this country great again. But what individuals are we talking about? Are we talking about Hispanic Americans? Are we talking about Muslim Americans? But what Mr. Khan,
all
because
Americans.
Mr. Khan's
All
son
Americans.
would not be able to give his life for this country in Donald Trump's America. That's a fact.
I would disagree with you
but
on that one
how?
because all Americans, and we honor the Khans and their loss.
He would
It
not
is
be allowed
just-
in this country
it is
under Donald Trump's
devastating
America.
No, that is incorrect.
How is that incorrect? How is that incorrect?
It is incorrect. What Donald Trump has talked about doing is a temporary timeout to the Syrian refugee.
That's not what he said, though.
Yes, it
That's
is.
not. That's a new
Yes, it is.
position.
That may be
Khizr-
what you
Yes, it
think
is.
you'd like to do.
Khizr
but That's not
Khan's
what he
son
said.
That
gave
is
the
the
ultimate
position.
sacrifice
Yes,
along
he
with
did, and we
13
honor
other
that.
Muslim Americans
And we
since
honor
9/11. But the fact that even this morning when Senator Sessions and Donald Trump don't have enough empathy to recognize that Gold Star mother, to recognize Mr. Khan and his son's sacrifice, and we're sitting here acting as if Donald Trump has not been some type of demagogue that will not be repudiated by Republican leadership.
Do you
Because
think the
they
President of the
honor
United
the
States should have
Khans
called Donald
and-
Trump a demagogue? People give Donald Trump a hard time about name-calling, and there's the President of the United States doing the same thing at the convention.
I think that's a fair statement. I mean, listen, Donald Trump has taken the political discourse somewhere that is below where we need to be in terms of President of the United States. There's no question about that. But Donald Trump's rhetoric is more than divisive. Donald Trump's rhetoric is disrespectful. I mean, I'm hoping that somebody in the Republican Party, and I think that Khizr Khan said it best, I'm hoping that either Mitch McConnell or Paul Ryan or someone steps up and says, this type of rhetoric has no place in the political discourse.
Here's the thing. Everybody has a right to speak, but I, for the life of me, cannot figure out why Donald Trump would say that that man doesn't have a right to say what he did. You can disagree with what he said, but why is Donald Trump picking this fight? And this has just been the theme of the entire campaign season. We lurch from one controversy to the next. And Congressman laid out a much better case for why Donald Trump may have not produced his manufacturing in America than Donald Trump ever has. He should be listening to smart Republicans who know how to talk about these issues instead of forcing Republicans to defend these wild and, quite frankly, heartbreaking things that he does every day.
Let's talk about the conventions themselves. Donald Trump, after saying he wanted a more Hollywood-like convention, put out a video blasting the Democrats for putting on something of that sort. Let's watch this video.
You heard the speech, but behind the glitter lies this stark truth. In Hillary Clinton's America, things get worse. Under her dishonest plan, taxes keep rising, terrorism spreads. Washington insiders remain in control. Americans losing their jobs, homes, and hope.
Congressman Becerra, you know, there is a message there that potentially could work in this campaign, and that people, you know, by and large, they are not comfortable with Hillary Clinton as president. There are just huge poll numbers showing that they're just uncomfortable with Hillary Clinton as president, and it keeps Donald Trump in this campaign to some extent. What do you make of that video and that notion that Hillary Clinton is just somebody that a lot of people don't trust as president of the United States?
Jim, I think at the convention, people saw who Hillary Clinton is. They saw not just what she would do by what Hillary Clinton said she would do, but she heard from the people who know her best. Her daughter, her husband, many of the people who have worked with her. All of them showed how tough she can be, how experienced she is, but at the end of the day, how she's a human being and understands the plight of so many Americans.
And Amanda, do you think the Democrats painted too rosy a picture? That was a message you heard from Donald Trump after this convention. They didn't talk about ISIS enough. They didn't talk about the violence against police officers enough.
Well, I mean, they talked about a wider range of issues than Republicans did at their convention. And I just want to touch on something. A lot of the Democrats, they spent a lot of time bringing up Hillary's character. And I thought going through the convention, watching it, wow, you know, they might really have a shot at getting a lot of Republican voters until Hillary Clinton started talking in that acceptance speech, where the first half of it, she kind of gave a nod to people that care about the Constitution. And then the second half was like, here's my progressive agenda, is we're going to have a rerun of the Obama administration. And I said, there it is. She undid so much of the goodwill that they may have generated among Republicans in the first half of that convention.
You know, she proved the point that she believes that government is the solution to every problem. And she laid it out in her speech. Lost opportunity.